We're building a model of the macroeconomy, and our goal is to be able to predict business cycles and explain how the economy will respond to changes in the environment. We've started with this aggregate demand curve, which is kind of the main axis of the model that we're building. The aggregate demand curve shows how total spending in the economy is related to the aggregate price level. And the aggregate price level influences total spending through three channels. First of all, rising prices shrink the real wealth of consumers and lead them to purchase less. Next, rising prices increase the demand for money, pushing up interest rates and leading businesses to spend less. And finally, rising prices cause our goods in our economy to be uncompetitive so that foreigners buy goods from other countries, shrinking net exports. The effect is that when prices rise, total spending falls, and that means equilibrium income in the economy, equilibrium spending is less. That's why the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. Now, the next question is, what would cause this curve to shift? A shift in the aggregate demand curve means that there's more demand for goods and services in our economy at every price level. That means for any given price level, people want to buy more stuff, and so factories respond by producing more. Let's ask the question then, what would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift outward from this original curve, AD0, to this new curve, AD1? On AD1, the total spending in the economy is greater at any given price level. So here's the question you need to answer. What would cause people to spend more money if the price level didn't change? We know that rising price levels have the effect of shrinking total spending, but what would cause people to spend more at any given price level? The first answer is an increase in autonomous spending. Autonomous means stuff that's by itself, unto itself, not caused by something else. If consumers decided they just wanted to spend more money for the heck of it, they were feeling rich or confident about the future of the economy, then an increase in consumer spending at every price level would shift this curve outwards. More GDP because factories have to produce more to keep up with increased consumer demand. The second thing could be an increase in autonomous investment spending. If businesses are feeling confident, they may decide to spend more on factories, plant and equipment. If that's the case, at any given price level, we have a larger aggregate demand and businesses have to produce more to satisfy that. The same with foreigners. An increase in autonomous net exports comes about whenever foreigners decide they want more of our country's goods at every price level. So that's the first thing that shifts out the aggregate demand curve, an increase in autonomous spending from any of these components. The second set of things that can increase aggregate demand are related to policy variables. So let me list them then in order. The first of the policy variables is government spending. If the government decides that it wants to spend more, that is, if there's an increased amount of government spending on goods and services, that adds directly to aggregate demand at every price level. So if the government starts building more roads and bridges and spending money on schools and things like that, this increased government spending increases aggregate demand in the economy, so businesses have to respond to produce the stuff that the government wants. So that's one policy variable. It's autonomous. The government can increase its spending or decrease its spending anytime it wants. But when the government increases spending, we have an outward shift in aggregate demand. Another component that can shift the curve that's related to policy, a second one, is taxes. Now, taxes have the opposite effect, because when taxes go up, people have less disposable income, and therefore they're inclined to spend less. But when taxes fall, that's like giving extra income to consumers. And usually consumers will spend a big chunk of it, and that increases aggregate demand at any price level. So if the government wants to shift out the aggregate demand curve, if the government wants to increase aggregate demand, the government has two policy tools to use: government spending and taxes. An increase in government spending shifts the curve out, and a reduction in taxes shifts the aggregate demand curve out. The final policy variable that can shift out the aggregate demand curve is a change in the money supply. If the money supply increases, then interest rates are going to fall because there'll be excess supply of money at the original interest rate. The bidding mechanism pushes down the interest rate, and businesses respond by doing more business spending at any given price level. So an increase in the money supply shifts out the aggregate demand curve because of its direct effect on interest rates. So there you have it. That's what can shift the aggregate demand curve outwards. To shift the aggregate demand curve inwards, just reverse all of these stories. Decrease autonomous spending, reduce government spending, raise taxes, or shrink the money supply. So the outward and inward shift of the aggregate demand curve can just happen naturally because of changes in the behavior of the big spenders in the economy. Or it can happen by choice. A policy shift can move this curve. Now we'll see later why the government may want to change its spending or why the Fed may want to change the money supply in order to calm the business cycle or stimulate the economy. But first, we'll need to expand our model by adding an aggregate supply curve. Then we can put supply and demand together and find an equilibrium price level for the economy and an equilibrium level of real gross domestic product.